Hello and welcome to episode 5 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, I speak to CJ Strachan, the founder of the Fair Job Initiative, on how equality, diversity and inclusion took over the workplace.
These EDI managers have gone completely off-piste to the tune that actually a lot of the stuff they've been doing has turned out to be unlawful.
Andy Collingwood, co-host of the Multipolarity podcast, who gives us a deep dive into Labour's radical social agenda.
It's quite difficult for people to imagine just how ideological these people are. They have a project to remake Britain.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic, our bonus interview this week is with Daily Sceptic regular Ben Pyle on the BBC's attempts to smear a Kenyan farmer as a shield for big oil. If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Now, many Daily Sceptic readers will know that equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives have exploded into public life in recent years, especially the workplace. There's the relatively innocuous end of rainbow lanyards and pronouns in email signatures. Then there's people having to spend countless hours in diversity training, which is often very divisive. And then there's people even being fired for violating woke speech codes. So when did work go woke? Well, I'm pleased to be joined now by someone who can answer that question for us, and that's CJ Strachan, the founder of Fair Job and a regular contributor to the Daily Sceptic. Welcome, Mr. Strachan.
Hello, Laurie. Thank you for having me.
So to start with, can you just give us an idea of how we ended up in this situation where the workplace is so politicised?
Yeah, sure, Laurie. I mean, very briefly, and I think it's important to contextualise this. It's not my job to talk about where things like critical race theory comes from, where woke theories, where the Frankfurt School was, and whether or not Yuri Bezmenov was right, and whether or not we've got a problem with the infiltration of the West by the Kremlin in the 1960s. My job is to try and identify what's happened in the workplace and explain that so we can know what to do about it. Now, this goes back really into the 1990s when we first started to see corporate social responsibility becoming a thing. So you'd get, companies, okay, we're going to commit not to dump our waste in the pond or whatever. It was to engage with local communities and show that you're being a responsible employer. Now, like so many things, this then became commoditized. You start getting businesses spilling off the back of it. Those businesses turn into lobby groups. And next thing you know, you've got a situation where you're getting investor activists who are then demanding things like ESG. So that's environment, social responsibility and governance policies being pushed down through the corporate investment market. And also at the same time, you've got a parallel thing happening in the public sector where you've got activists getting into the civil service and taking these ideas and pushing them again through the procurement processes. So if you want to sell paperclips to an NHS trust, you'd better have an EDI policy because they won't work with you unless you do. And this is now pretty much ubiquitous across any business that's supplying to either a large corporate or to a public sector organization. Now, that's been going along for some time now. Where things have really become turbocharged has been since 2020 and the George Floyd situation in the summer of 2020. And that saw a serious change in, first of all, the pace at which this was being deployed, and secondly, how it was being deployed, and thirdly, the type of EDI that was being deployed off the back of that.
Right. And so it seems like a lot of this has really taken off since the so-called racial reckoning in summer 2020 with Black Lives Matter. Is that right?
So when George Floyd was killed, there was obviously a huge outpouring of outrage by populations across the West, many of whom were sitting at home without anything else to worry about. Not wanting to disparage that incident or anything. It was very shocking. But you suddenly had a lot of people who were wanting to do something and didn't know what to do. Lots of company directors, employers, particularly in the blue chips, were very keen to try and demonstrate that their companies cared. Now, what happened is they turned around to their HR departments and they said to the HR departments, do something. We want you to show that we are not like this, that our organization is progressive, understands that, the challenges that communities feel. Now, contextually, at the time, these HR departments, I was working on one at the time, were absolutely up to our ears with the fallout of COVID. So we had lockdown, we had we had social distancing, we had all sorts of policies within the workplace, we had furlough. It was we were under a lot of pressure to keep the show on the road. I was working in healthcare at the time, so there was all the added issues that we had there. And suddenly you had your chief executive officer turning around going, we need you to do something. So what happened is that HR directors and HR teams went out and they said, well, we haven't got necessarily anything in-house, so we're going to bring something in from outside. So you had a huge demand for EDI training, DEI training. You had a huge demand for hiring EDI, DEI professionals. Now, when in any situation where you have an enormous demand that manifests very, very quickly, supply will rise to meet that demand, but quality will drop. Yeah. And that's exactly what happened here. Now, I don't want to get into debates just now about whether or not EDI is a good thing. Personally, I don't think it is. But the reality is that it's been forced on businesses. So we need to make sure that what EDI we are doing isn't going to cause damage to the workplace relationships in our places of work. And unfortunately, the evidence suggests that it is. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, what's happened here is that in 2020 is you suddenly had training companies who were coming into organizations to train them on things like unconscious bias, which of course has been debunked and was debunked quite a long time ago, but nonetheless it's been picked up and pushed. You also had training companies who were being pretty amateur. I remember viewing one salesperson's material, and he had a module that talked about how segregation laws impacted systemic racism in the workplace. And I said to the guy, what are you talking about, segregation laws? We've never had segregation laws in the United Kingdom. And of course, what they'd done is they'd lifted a training course, lock, stock and barrel, off some American website, rebranded it, recombobulated it a bit, and were selling it into corporates and employers across the UK. And when you've got big bosses going, help, we need to do something, and you've got HR departments who are swamped. And I think, certainly some of the corporate HR managers and directors we've spoken to who are beginning to realise that this wasn't such a good idea after all, say that they were guilty of actually treating this in the same way that you'd hire, I don't know, a payroll director or a resourcing director or another one of their reports. They were hiring EDI managers, huge demand for EDI managers. An awful lot of them are activists who are coming into the workplace. And the HR director, when they hire me to look after recruitment, they just want to let me get on with it. They're not going to be micromanaging me. And they did exactly the same thing with these EDI managers. And under a lot of circumstances, these EDI managers have gone completely off-piste to the tune that actually a lot of the stuff they've been doing has turned out to be unlawful under the Equality Act. So we've now got a problem. We've now painted ourselves into a corner. And it's been very interesting seeing how things have manifested this year, because this year it seems that certainly in the corporate world, maybe not the public sector, HR directors and boards are beginning to wake up to the problem.
So you said that the inciting incident behind this was the George Floyd protests in June 2020. But in terms of the mindset behind this, what do you think was the driving force going on here?
I think the driving force behind it is that people want to be seen to be doing the right thing. And, we do know that from human nature that it doesn't take very many activists to destroy a nation. You've only got to look what happened in with the Bolshevik Revolution. There were only a few thousand Bolsheviks, and yet they were able to topple an empire. And they did that not because they did the toppling. They did it because people who thought that going along with what they were demanding was the right thing to do. And you've got a similar situation, albeit maybe not quite as serious, with EDI here. So EDI is something that's very difficult to do if you can do it well at all, which I would debate, because what happens is that you're taking something that has to be designed, first of all, specifically for the society you're trading it into. So you can't just cut and paste from America. The second thing is you've got to make sure that you are not questioning the values of the audience that you're trying to train. Okay, you're not saying you're morally, reprehensible and you need to be retrained by the HR department. And you also need to make sure that it's done in a neutral way, so there's no actual activism or bias. Because if you do this in any other way, then DEI or EDI becomes an ideology of its own. And what's happened here is when you take something that's really complicated and turn it into a digital commoditized training course and give it to 26-year-old HR managers, nothing against 26-year-old HR managers, but you give it to junior people to deploy, especially if they're activists, then what happens is that they will do precisely the opposite. They'll turn it into something that's formulaic, and they'll turn it into something that does actually question the values of the people who you're working with. So companies spend hundreds of thousands of pounds every year on employee engagement in order to increase the productivity of their company. And then they undermine it by basically saying to their staff, you're all moral reprobates, you're all absolutely delinquent, and we need to retrain you because you're so horrible. So the HR team are now going to reprogram you. And that's basically what you're saying when you do EDI in this way, and that's what's happened. And we can see that from the reports. I mean, first of all, there was the government report that was published in March of this year by the Department of Business and Trade, which was an independent report. There have been efforts to sort of dismiss it as a Kemi Badenoch report. It wasn't. Secondly, we have the Free Speech Unions report. And thirdly, we have the Policy Exchange report. The methodology behind all these reports, which have been published since March, is very, very sound, and it shows we've got a major problem in the British workplace. This has backfired spectacularly. It's costing our business hundreds of millions of pounds. And worse than that, it's creating atmospheres at work, which are atmospheres of fear, of people treading on eggshells, and of a place where workforces are divided. It's doing precisely the opposite of what was intended.
Absolutely. I mean, and it sounds like a really difficult environment for any employer, but particularly small businesses who might not have a huge amount of money to devote to HR. And I know that you've worked in HR, and using your experience with it, you set up something called Fair Job, which is to help small businesses in particular navigate these choppy waters. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
Sure, yes. So we set up the Fair Job initiative because, as you say, small businesses are under a particular pressure here. We know that 65% of the UK population has been trained in EDI. We know that 62% of the UK population works in small businesses. So that indicates that small businesses have been training. Some small businesses have been training people in EDI. Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because we know that so often EDI, when it's done on the cheap, is extremely damaging. Now, the problem is that small businesses will only ever spend money on training when they absolutely have to. And that they're spending the money because they're being told that if you want to sell paperclips to an NHS trust, you must have this, you must have EDI training, you have to have EDI policies. So what they're doing is they're going onto the internet and they're downloading whatever course comes across at 100 quid a delegate or whatever online course they can find. The problem is that these courses cause a hell of a lot of problems in the workplace. Now, the small businesses are enforcing these courses in two ways. They seem to be enforcing in two ways. They're either saying to the staff, look, just jump through the hoops. Don't worry about it, everybody. You'll be fine. We just got to tick a box and then we can, we'll get the contract. Or they're saying, this is what we're doing now, and there's going to be zero tolerance. And anybody who crosses or disputes with this, you're out. Now, that seems to have happened in a lot of cases. So the problem with a small business is that if you get this wrong, it can be existential. Now, we believe that, and in fact, this is something that bigger companies are now looking at as well, that businesses should have no involvement in any politics, any ideology, or link themselves to any third-party organization or event. Now, you might have seen this week, Tractor Supply, a major US retailer, has just 180-degree U-turned on their DEI policy following a kickback from their customer base. And they released a statement 2 days ago saying that they were going to be doing exactly that. And that's something we've been advocating for some months now. What we ask people to do is join us. We start at about £19 a month, and for your business. And this is designed for the very smallest business. And what we do is we train and we help the business introduce what we call the 6 rules for workplace harmony. And these are very simple. And they start with no politics, no activism, be professional, treat others in the way you would like to be treated, make sure that you're always willing to accept others' opinions and their right to those opinions, be professional, and most importantly, always assume the good intent of others. Because I think one of the problems of EDI is it actually assumes the opposite. It assumes that people have got bad intent, that they need to be reprogrammed. So we take this very simple set of 6 rules and we help businesses implement this so that they can create a culture at work where people feel as if they've got a fair chance of not being fired because they put a joke about Billy Connolly on their own private Facebook account, as Asda did to somebody a few years ago, or having some employer doing work, social media offense archaeology when they apply for a job. This is, people have got have a right to change their minds throughout their lives. So we're putting that relationship of respecting the rights of people to hold to different opinions at the core of the relationship at work, and removing activism from the workplace. It is not the job of an employer to endorse the views or promote the lifestyles or beliefs of its employees. It's just not. Don't do it. And we've seen companies like Google get themselves into huge trouble over this.
Google, you can't hide. We charge you with genocide.
In indulging this employee activism to the tune that this March, they ended up having to act against 60 employees who had occupied Google's headquarters and demanded that they would stay there until Google scrapped their business with the state of Israel. And Google had to say, well, that's it. Sorry, we're not going to do this anymore. And they scrapped it all. So you would have heard something very similar to what we do from what Coinbase did in the States during 2020, during the George Floyd situation. And the CEO at Coinbase, he bucked the trend and got a lot of grief, lost a lot of employees by saying, we are not going to be doing this corporate virtue signaling or bringing in EDI or bringing in radical policies or supporting BLM or supporting Stonewall. We're not going to do any of that. And if you don't agree with us, then you better go somewhere else. And as a result, he's now, in hindsight, been seen as a sort of, as a prophet of actually, well, this was going to happen. And I think anybody sensible would have thought it was going to happen. We've seen it for a while. We've been thinking about doing something like this for a while. There's a lot of HR people who are very uncomfortable with what's happened. So this is why we set up the Fair Job Initiative. And we don't just work with small businesses, we work with larger ones as well. But first and foremost, you need to set the workplace relations in your place of work, especially if you're a small business. And the problem is lots of small businesses don't think they need this. On top of that, we also give them a suite of HR policies to help them enforce this. So, there's no politics. This is what we're doing. If you've got any issues with that, if you're upset because, Fred there is a Catholic and, Muhammad there is a Muslim and whatever, and they're not endorsing your lifestyle, that's your problem. Okay. That's not for the workplace. Everybody at work gets on with each other. So that's why we set up Fair Job.
Absolutely. I mean, it all just sounds so eminently sensible, keep politics out of work, treat people fairly, operate with good faith, and keep the activism out, right? But how did we end up in a situation where there is so much activism in the workplace? And do you think that elected governments are partly to blame?
I think it's very difficult to necessarily blame elected governments. I would blame my generation. So I'm in my 50s, and an awful lot of us in our 30s were quite happy to sit around in the noughties and the 90s and let let the good times roll. We didn't get involved in steering the direction of the country, and we let activists get a grip into organisations. So I'm loath to blame elected politicians too much here. I think what we've seen from the Conservative government in the last few years is a situation where an elected government has tried to get a grip on things, but has been unable to because of the level of political capture in the civil service and in other institutions. I think that the Equality Act has been a bit of a double-edged sword. So there's a lot of ire against the Equality Act, and if you'd asked me, was it a good idea? In hindsight, no, it wasn't a good idea. But that's not to say it's a bad thing. And I think a lot of people on the Conservative side, and particularly on the right, think that the Equality Act is all poison. Now, it's not, because actually, at the moment, it's the Equality Act that's defending people in the workplace. It is defending the gender critical feminists. It is defending the people with religious views from being persecuted by woke activists. Okay. So I think one of the things that should have been included should have been strict rules on the limits on guaranteeing freedom of speech. And I think we also needed rules about guaranteeing employment rights and guaranteeing and extending the ideological protections that you have in the Equality Act to political opinion. I think that should have been done as well. So you can't penalise people for their politics. I think, Laurie, though, that what we've actually got here at the heart of things is a cultural rather than a political issue. And the reason why it's dangerous in the workplace is because they can hurt you in the workplace. They can threaten you. They can take your livelihood away from you. The 4 nurses from Darlington Hospital who this week have lodged a case against their employer for allowing biological men into the changing facilities. They said quite clearly that they're worried about this because it will undermine their careers. By taking this stance will undermine their careers. And certainly, from my perspective and from my colleagues' perspective, there's an element of having burnt our boats on the beach with Fair Job and with other businesses that are in this space, because who's got the courage to hire an HR person like me into a corporate job when I'm doing something quite high profile like this? So we are fighting a cultural battle here. I don't like to use the word cultural war. I think it's been over cliched, but we have to understand that this is a difference between people who believe in the values of freedom of speech and the privacy and in the right for everybody to hold their own opinion and in the principle of agreeing to disagree and putting aside our differences to get along with a joint goal, and those who believe that politics is everything. And anybody who doesn't agree with their politics is incorrigible and should be cancelled. That's essentially the battle line here. So yeah, I think politics has something to do with it. Culture, and this is culture though. And actually, one of the things we're really busy at the moment is we're very worried about the impact of a Labour government. We are an apolitical company. We don't particularly take a stance, but it's Labour who are talking about interfering most in the world of business. Now, quite what Labour think they're doing to small businesses, given that Labour, these small businesses have spent the last 5 years surviving by the skin of their teeth following COVID and all the other problems that we've had in terms of inflation, etc. And now Labour are about to land a whole load of new policies on the small businesses, which are going to turn small businesses into and workplaces up and down the country into places of ideological conflict, because they're doubling down on intersectional identity politics and they're putting it into the workplace. So the Labour Party will make EDI a statutory requirement in public sector procurement. Now, it pretty much is anyway, but it will be harder to push back on when it's statutory. So we've got extensions to the and changing the Equality Act. We're going to have a specific bit of racial equality act, so some employees will be more equal than others, and this is going to play havoc. And so what we're doing at the moment is we're very busy trying to work out a suite of strategies to help our small business clients and other clients navigate what's going to happen in the next 5 years. And I don't think it's going to be pretty.
Indeed. Well, CJ Strachan, thanks very much for coming on.
No probs, Laurie. Good to see you, and we'll speak soon. Take care.
Well, worrying stuff indeed. Now, there is an election on, and people are increasingly warning about the radical agenda that Labour may have if it comes to power. We heard last week from one of our writers, Jay Sorrell, on the anti-democratic mindset behind all of this. But I'm pleased to be joined now by Andy Collingwood, writer and co-host of the Multipolarity podcast, who's written this week for us explaining some of the specifics of Labour's radical agenda. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start by going through a few of these. So you begin with Gordon Brown's 2022 constitutional reform document called A New Britain, and in that he's got this concept of social rights. And you say that these will have a tremendous effect on transforming the way that Britain is governed. Can you just explain that for us?
Yeah, so to understand the sort of constitutional reform that Labour are likely to enact, we have to rewind a little bit to 2022, when Gordon Brown produced the report of the Commission on the UK's Future, called A New Britain, Renewing Democracy and Rebuilding Our Economy. And this was a report or pamphlet, if you like, that was endorsed by Keir Starmer. And in this report, there were a whole range of constitutional and social reforms which Mr. Brown suggested, some of which, many of which, in fact, have found their way into the Labour manifesto, either directly, it's either, absolutely stated that they found their way in, or if you read between the lines, you feel that, yes, they have found their way in. So one of the important aspects of this report that Mr. Brown produced in 2022 was the idea of extending rights, as in like human rights, almost constitutional rights, if you like, to the social realm. And to explain what that means, Brown in this report suggested creating essentially a right, like not just a desire of government, not just an aim, but a right to be protected against poverty and receive from the government that assistance which you need to not be living in poverty, essentially. Now, obviously, a lot of people on the libertarian and perhaps even the social conservative and even maybe the left wing might say that sounds preposterous in and of itself, given the definitions of poverty, etc., etc. But I think for anybody who's interested in being able to reform the UK or change the nature of the state or just govern in a different way to the centre-left, centre-right, Blairite, Cameron consensus in any future government that they may wish to be part of, it could potentially be lethal. So the way to think about it is this. In the same way that the Human Rights Act, which basically imported the European Convention of Human Rights into British law in 1998, has hobbled the efforts of conservative governments to remove illegal migrants, stop small boat channel crossings, into the UK. You can imagine a similar situation where people have a right not to be in poverty, hobbling future governments in their efforts to say, for instance, reform social security or reform the economy. Could it be a situation where a government wants to pass a policy and a civil servant says, well, I'm very sorry, Minister, but this is basically going to be against the law because a reasonable reading of, Clause 8 of this act would say that it's going to push people into poverty. And now they have this right to do, to not be in poverty. So we believe that actually an NGO-funded court appeal against this law would actually be successful. And therefore, you're not going to be able to enact this. The other really interesting thing about this, and I think this is an important point for some people who have perhaps been slow to learn how the progressive liberal left work in Britain, is that they're going to achieve this not by passing new legislation that brings in the right not to live in poverty, which is what people on my social conservative side of the spectrum kind of tend to expect and the way that we perhaps operate. What they're going to simply do is, in inverted commas, enact the socio-economic duty of the Equality Act of 2010. They're not going to bring anything new in. They're just going to instruct all the relevant bodies of UK's public administration to enact a clause in an old act from 15 years ago. And by doing that, I think Polly Toynbee said that it's socialism in one clause. So this is the sort of thing that we're contending with in Sir Keir Starmer's constitutional reform package. And that's not all, but I think this is one of the more brazen examples.
Definitely. And just to push this a bit further, suppose there's a given fiscal decision that needs to be made, say raising or lowering taxes or making some kind of reform to welfare. Now, people would usually assume that that would be taken by a politician, weighing up various economic consequences and trade-offs and deciding on it. But why do you think that's an important way for the decision to be taken by an accountable politician as opposed to being enshrined in law?
Well, as we've seen over the last 10, 15 years or so, the way that the British system should work in theory is not how it's working in effect. Britain is a representative democracy. You elect representatives to go govern for you, to go write legislation for you. What we actually have, in effect, at the moment, is a system where we elect people in theory to do that, but they're absolutely hobbled in their ability to do so. Earlier on, I gave the example of removing the Channel small boat migrant crossings. The people who come here have, I think, something like 70% of these people are accepted for asylum instantly, and even the ones that aren't are accepted thereafter, effectively. And the British government is unable to take any effective action to remove them once they're in the United Kingdom. And the reason for that is a series of interlocking international obligations and domestic law and court interpretations which prevent them from doing so. In effect, the British government can't do what it was elected to do. The Conservative government was very clearly elected on a manifesto of lowering migration, and especially illegal migration, or especially asylum seekers crossing the Channel uninvited. Now, as you increase the number of obligations of the state in a variety of areas, especially if you start extending, so-called rights into the social sphere or giving new unelected bodies powers, then you're leeching more and more power away from the House of Commons and the House of Lords and more broadly the Crown in Parliament and into a diffuse set of unelected organisations. So this is very important. And I think really it's part of the shift in Britain, the broader shift in Britain historically away from representative democracy and toward what might be called stakeholder democracy. This was something that Tony Blair was very keen on. But I think, to be fair, it was already something that was starting under John Major. But the idea of stakeholder democracy broadly is that in a representative democracy, what's important is the demos. They elect the government. They decide, how the country is going to be run based on the representatives that they elect to do so. In a stakeholder democracy, the demos is just one of many stakeholders that have a say in how a country is run. So you have, the electorate, but you also might have large corporations. You might have academic experts who bring very specific knowledge to the table. You might have charitable organizations, think tanks, social pressure groups, the NGO complex, and so on and so forth. And in this, the demos isn't necessarily the most important. And the idea is that countries, the argument for stakeholder democracies, countries are better run by this combination of experts and academics and corporations and of course the electorate as well, but only as kind of one component of that, than they are by the electorate on their own and the kind of plucky amateurs that they elect. I happen to disagree with that, and I think that history has proven indubitably that these folks don't run countries better. Like, the technocrats aren't technocratic, the elites aren't elite. And therefore, we should be very wary of that. But what Sir Keir is doing in his manifesto in several places is he's furthering the shift to stakeholder democracy, essentially. And I think that's why, in much broader terms, we should be concerned about this. For anybody interested, by the way, I think the left-wing political thinker and author Thomas Fazzi, who is Italian, has written very interestingly about the history of stakeholder democracy and how it rose in the West. And perhaps people who listen to your podcast aren't used to reading, left-wing political thought, but I do recommend they look that up and familiarize themselves with it, because it does provide some of the intellectual tools to understand what's happening at the moment.
Okay, so we mentioned these moves against parliamentary sovereignty at Westminster, and obviously another, far-reaching change in that regard brought in by New Labour was devolution. And as you mentioned, in Brown's constitutional document, there are pushes for Devo Max, so even more devolution, and that includes regional assemblies. So could you just tell us a bit more about that? And in particular, isn't it strange that they're pushing for this now when, devolution doesn't really seem to be going very well in Scotland and Wales, and in many ways, the stock of the devolved governments has never been lower?
I think one of the things that people fail to understand about the modern liberal left is that although they're billed as centrists, they're extremely ideological, and they will not let any event or fact or history or failure get in the way of their ideological project. What they'll do is they'll treat it as a speed bump on the road, or at worst, a blockage that they just need to go around. And I think that's very much the case with Gordon Brown's report and its talk of giving yet further powers to Holyrood in Scotland and essentially handing them Devo Max. And that has very much found its way into the Labour manifesto. If you read the Labour manifesto itself, I mean, the section on devolution and the constitutional settlement within the nations of the United Kingdom talks extensively about greater powers of Scotland, but especially it talks constantly about Scotland's position abroad. And one of the key powers that Gordon Brown suggested handing over to the Scottish Parliament was the power to make international treaties. Now, this really strikes at I kind of almost wordless, saying it out of my own, hearing myself say this, because signing and agreeing to international treaties is really at the heart of what it is to be a sovereign single nation. The idea that, say, Texas could go off and sign a treaty with other countries would just be anathema, or Catalonia, or whatever. And this is what Gordon Brown wants to hand to Scotland, and it's very clear that is also what Labour want to do. I mean, Scotland already, in my view anyway, and if you read people like Stephen Daisley in The Spectator, I think they would agree, Scotland already acts kind of ultra virus in terms of setting up these missions abroad, which are really de facto embassies, which is way outside the current devolution settlement. But it seems very much that Labour is keen on essentially recognising that and saying, yeah, okay, not only can you do that, but we're going to support you in your efforts doing it. It even talks about having the UK government promote Brand Scotland. I mean, this reads very much like they're essentially setting up an independent state. They're going to allow them to, sign and agree to some international treaties. They're going to allow them to partner with international bodies as they see fit, insofar as it doesn't clash with anything that the United Kingdom does as a whole. And in addition, they're going to promote a separate national identity for Scotland abroad, internationally.
Yes, it's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? Okay, so we've spoken about devolution, we've spoken about social rights, but there are a few other quite radical social policies in Labour's manifesto. Can you just give us a quick sort of roundup of those?
Yeah, the Labour manifesto is peppered with policies that are, handed a few sentences here or there, and which ought to be quite terrifying to the social conservative, or in fact, anybody who wants to transform government. So, for instance, giving the Office of Budget Responsibility further powers. I mean, the last Labour government handed the Bank of England independence. So younger listeners might not remember, but in the 1990s and 1980s and before that, the Chancellor of the Exchequer set monetary policy. But they handed that power to an unelected quango, essentially, which we call the Bank of England. Now, what Labour is talking about doing is giving the Office of Budget Responsibility further powers to assess fiscal policy. They haven't quite specified what powers that might be, but does that mean that the OBR is going to have a veto over the Chancellor of the Exchequer's spending policies? If you remove setting monetary policy from the Chancellor and then give a quango a veto over fiscal policy, what exactly is left for democracy? There's also the infamous votes for 16-year-olds. People completely miss the point about this. I have to say, Laurie, people assume that votes for 16-year-olds is a cynical vote grab by Labour. They're saying, look, 16 and 17-year-olds are all left-wing, and that'll mean more votes for Labour. No, That's not the point. They're missing the point completely. The idea is that in every future election from now, parties will have to pander to this extremely socially liberal, extremely left-wing group of voters. And that means that all parties will have to be a little bit more left-wing if they're not to just lose that section of the population already. It's yet another effort by Labour to make social conservatism more difficult in the future. And then finally, I would say the big one is the Racial Equality Act that they want to pass, which, talks about forcing companies over a certain size to publish their wage information and break it down on ethnic levels. So, like Hindu Indians earn this, Pakistanis, Muslims earn this, Afro-Caribbean people earn this, and so on and so forth. I cannot think of a more divisive thing that you could possibly, you could rack your brain and not find a single more divisive thing. I mean, this is really, 1920s, the kulaks are richer than you because they cheat territory. Because you know what's going to happen. They're going to rank it and say, aha, Pakistani Muslims earn less than white people. Isn't that terrible? Aha, this Chinese person earns more than this Bangladeshi person. And they will blame it on racism. That's the modus operandi. And it will be extraordinarily divisive.
Okay, so some very radical stuff there. But it often seems that social conservatives in many ways are not really reckoning with quite how radical some of this stuff is. Why do you think that is? Well,
look at how long it took social conservatives to realise what the true damage of the Human Rights Act of 1998 and the Equality Act of 2010 had done. It's only fairly recently that these have become popularised online. And I get the impression that a lot of Conservative MPs are still in the dark, that actually their efforts to kind of act as a bulwark against the spread of diversity, equity and inclusion throughout the British state are being foiled all the time. They don't quite understand what it is that's stopping them. And that's the legal requirements from acts long ago. They still can't quite grasp why they can't get rid of illegal migrants. They still can't quite grasp why they can't stop the boats crossing the channel. And it's because of the laws that were passed 15, 25 years ago. It's as simple as that. So how long do you think it's going to take them to figure out what's in a Labour manifesto that was published 6 weeks ago and is deliberately vague in its language? It's going to take a while. I think the other thing is that social conservatives tend to think in entirely different ways. And Tony Blair especially was painted as right-wing just because he kind of accepted in kind of very broad terms, Margaret Thatcher's neoliberal economic settlement. And Starmer himself is painted as kind of centrist as well. And I think that's very congruous with his almost kind of preternatural dullness, really. How can a man, so dull that seems to kind of suck charisma out of any room he steps into, possibly be revolutionary? Revolutionaries look like Mussolini and Hitler and Lenin. They don't look like Keir Starmer, for goodness sake. So I think it's quite difficult for people to imagine just how ideological these people are. Like, they have a project. They have a project to remake Britain, and people simply don't grasp that. Social conservatives don't grasp it. And it's just not presented in the media as such. We talk about, the media is obsessed with whether people might end up paying an extra penny on their income tax with one party or the other. And they miss entirely the fact that this government is going to embark on a radical constitutional social reform program. And I think the final thing is that social conservatives are simply demoralized at the moment. I think a lot of us were quite enthused about, at least, if not Boris Johnson himself, then the platform upon which he won the last election, because it showed that Britain was undertaking, going through one of its once-a-century tectonic shifts in politics, where from the 1940s, the big cleavage between the party was economics, and we were shifting again, and the big cleavage from now was going to be social issues. And we were enthused by the way that the Conservatives had made ground in the blue wall, and hoped that this would lead to a shift away from the kind of economic and social liberalism by which they had governed previously, and towards something much more interesting. And I think they've made such a pig's ear of it. And I think, Starmer has such a commanding lead in the polls that a lot of folks are kind of demoralized. They read that that Starmer is a kind of a centrist and a boring one at that. They see endless complaints on the left that he's not radical enough, and that kind of reassures them. And then they kind of just miss the wood for the trees. It's sad, but I think that really explains it.
Okay, well, Andy Collingwood, thanks very much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.